efficient buildings, energy efficient building codes, and pilot project models with a focus on increasing energy efficiency across residential, commercial, and municipal buildings. Her work really is centered on creating pathways for equity through energy efficiency, particularly in the workforce sphere. And then we have Jamal Lewis, who's the Senior Director of Implementation, Learning, and Integration at Rewiring America. Jamal has led national efforts to advance electrification, healthy housing, and energy efficiency programs with a particular focus on promoting equity. His expertise spans across retrofitting existing houses to make them more energy efficient, electric, and affordable, ensuring that communities most in need are a part of the energy transition. So now that I've read some brief bios, I would like for all of us to set the stage. So when we talk about decarbonization, what we're really discussing is an opportunity to dismantle the very systems that have contributed to environmental degradation while simultaneously creating new ones that can uplift our communities. And at its core, decarbonization is the process of reducing or eliminating carbon emissions from our energy systems, our buildings, and industries. But it isn't just a technical exercise. It's about reimagining how we live, how we consume, how we build a future that is sustainable, not just for the environment and our buildings, but also for its people. And energy efficiency, as we know, sits at the very heart of this transition for a more livable future. It is often the unsung hero of decarbonization, as we say, quietly reducing energy use in buildings, making our power grid more resilient, as we talked about it during panels earlier, and helping to lower utility bills for families. But energy efficiency is more than just a tool for cutting emissions. It truly is a pathway, as we know, to greater affordability, greater comfort, greater empowerment for its people. And without energy efficiency, the larger goals that we are all working towards in decarbonization, like electrification, like renewable energy integration, like data center expansion, and climate communications and carbon neutrality, that those wouldn't be achievable or equitable. And this is where equity and, more importantly, environmental justice must be interwoven into our decarbonization agenda, if you will, because in order to decarbonize effectively, we need to ensure that we're not only reducing emissions for the sake of hitting targets, but we're doing so in a way that centers the voices and the needs of those who have been historically left out of these conversations. Equity is not just who gets access to clean energy, it's about who is involved in shaping that access, who benefits from it, and also who bears the burden of inaction if we don't do this in a sustainable and resilient way, and a more efficient way, for lack of a better word. But within the context of decarbonization, environmental justice can be understood using three key pillars, and these are pillars that the father of environmental justice founded, which is distributive justice, procedural justice, and representative justice. Each of these pillars inform how we approach equity and energy transitions, and all three are very critical to ensuring that decarbonization as a whole benefits everyone, especially most getting impacted by the existing fossil fuel economy, whether we like that or not. Distributive justice, the first pillar, asks us to consider who benefits from decarbonization. For too long, as we know, the benefits of energy efficiency, clean energy, lower emissions have been concentrated in affluent communities, while low income and divested communities have been left to grapple with pollution, higher energy bills, toxic infrastructure, and impacts of climate change. This tenet of environmental justice requires us to think about how we allocate our resources, whether it's government subsidies, tax rebates for energy efficiency retrofits, access to community solar, or even investments in electric vehicle charging stations. Are all of these resources reaching the communities that need them most? What are we doing to change that? Are we targeting frontline communities that are already overburdened by environmental and energy burden concerns and just under-resourced in terms of energy access? These are questions that I ask myself consistently. And this is why energy efficiency is such a powerful tool in decarbonization, because with us reducing energy consumption, we not only reduce emissions, but we also lower costs and making it more affordable for everyone, especially those living in energy poverty. And I know many of our respective organizations engage with these populations consistently. But to achieve distributive justice, we need to ensure that energy efficiency programs are accessible to low to moderate income households, LMI households, and that they're designed with the needs of renters and homeowners alike, and that they prioritize investments in buildings that serve disadvantaged communities. And afterwards, we have procedural justice. Incorporating procedural justice means actively engaging these communities in the design and implementation of decarbonization policies. This in particular asks us to rethink in a way the traditional top-down approaches and move towards more community-led procedures and processes where those who are on the front lines of environmental harm are the ones setting priorities. And I then ask us to consider the final pillar, which is representative justice. It brings all of this together. Representative justice ensures that the people making decisions about things like niche things like building codes and energy policies to advance us with the VCA and decarbonization are truly reflective of the diverse communities that they're meant to serve. It's not enough to invite communities to the table or to loosely partner with them. We need to ensure that they're in leadership roles, that they're on boards, that they're the ones steering these processes and being a part of these advisory boards, coming from a large range of backgrounds and lived experiences. And this is especially, critical in the clean energy workforce, which we'll hear later. I'll wrap up my portion soon, but as we know, decarbonization is creating a new surge of job opportunities, but we must ask, who is filling these jobs? Are we building a workforce that is as diverse as the communities that we're trying to serve? I know, and I know that you all know, that we as an industry are falling short at such a critical point in this renewable energy transition within the Commonwealth. And we need to make sure that this transition represents one of the largest economic shifts of our time. And we really do have a unique opportunity to ensure that this transition creates pathways to meaningful employment, particularly those who have been historically left behind by the fossil fuel economy. And so that's why I preface this conversation with the tenets of environmental justice, because when these three pillars, distributive, procedural, and apologies, my cat is in the background, and representative justice are integrated into our decarbonization plans, whatever they may be, we are not just decarbonizing, we are democratizing energy, and we are creating a future where clean energy and energy efficiency are not just luxuries for the few, but fundamental rights for all. And this is how we ensure that decarbonization is not just effective or efficient, but that is transformative. And so as we delve into today's discussion, I encourage us all to keep these pillars at the forefront of our minds, which resonate most with you. Decarbonization cannot merely be seen as a technical solution to a global problem, much less a state problem. It must be like deeply equitable process that prioritizes the needs and the contributions of all communities, particularly those who have been, again, impacted by environmental harm or suffer severe energy burden. So thank you. And I look forward to hearing from Aaron, Maggie, and also Jamal as they share their thought-provoking insights on how we can all contribute to this vital, equitable transition to a fairer, energy-centered future. And on that note, I will pass it to Jamal.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamal. I work with an organization called Rewiring America. We are an organization that is advancing decarbonization through increasing access to electrification and a lot of IO in words. Electrification is simply the replacement of a fossil fuel burning machine with an efficient electric version of that machine. And so many of you may be familiar with this in the case of like electric vehicles. If you switch out a fossil fuel burning vehicle or a gas burning vehicle with a EV, you have electrified your transportation, thereby reducing your own personal greenhouse gas footprint. And so we're looking at pathways to do that um, across the economy. Next slide. So not necessarily an outline, but some key takeaways that hopefully you'll get from the presentation. How does electrification impact energy bills? What does it mean to decarbonize equitably? Why should we prioritize low and moderate income households? And understanding some decarbonization and equity trends across the country. Next slide. So many of you may be familiar with some of these stats or some of these facts, but burning gas in a home, it's basically like living with a smoker. I think another version of this is like breathing out of your car exhaust at times. And so it can really pollute one's home. The average American household would save an average of 18,000 or 1,800 a year by going electric. Of course, this is an average, and we're going to talk a little bit about the variations of this later. But there's a major opportunity not just to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and indoor air pollution, but also to save money by decarbonizing through electrification. And again, when we do electrify, we are able to address about 42% of our energy related emissions. Another way to say that is about 42% of our energy related emissions come from decisions that we make at the kitchen table. These are the decisions how we decide to cook our food, what we cook our food on, how we heat and cool our home, how we heat and cool our water, how we dry our clothes, if we drive, types of cars that we drive, and increasingly where we get our electricity from with the preponderance of renewable energy sources and like community solar, et cetera. Like these are increasingly decisions that we're able to make. Next slide. So we have this goal of electrifying 1 billion machines. In doing that, we will address the 42% of our energy related emissions and place a lot of our friends and neighbors on a path towards reduced energy costs and improved indoor air pollution, or a reduction in indoor air pollution. So again, this is the cars we drive, how we heat and cool our homes and water. Again, I've said most of this, so we can move on to the next slide. Electrification, again, is the act of replacing machine with a efficient electric version of the machine. We are not necessarily saying, rip out a perfectly functioning furnace for a heat pump. But over the course of our lifetime, we probably will have to deal with a broken furnace or a furnace that has reached the end of its useful life, or a car that has reached the end of its useful life. When it dies, that is the perfect opportunity to switch over to an efficient electric heat pump or an efficient electric version of that appliance. Next slide. All right, so here are some trends. Next slide. A lot of people are realizing just how beneficial electric machines are. Heat pump is an HVAC system that runs entirely on electricity and is the electric version of a gas furnace. For the first time in 2022, heat pumps outsold gas furnaces. And so people are realizing that heat pumps are superior technology. They're more efficient, about 3 times more efficient, and so you get more output for your for the amount of energy that you put in. And that trend continued into 2023 as well. So this transition is happening around us, and I think that's something that we should all be aware of. Next slide. One reason, even though that we were seeing that trend increase, it's actually going to increase likely more because there are incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act for electrification. So there are, many of you may be aware of the home electrification and appliance rebates. These are rebates that will be administered by the Virginia Department of Energy. It will help consumers, low and moderate income consumers, access equipment like heat pumps. There are also tax credits that are available as well, and then other incentives for like electric vehicles and renewable energy, as McKenna was saying. And so a lot of people say that there's 100 billion in the IRA, but it really can be a lot, much more than that, because the tax credits are unlimited. And so the amount that ends up getting spent in terms of tax credits would depend on how many people claim those tax credits. Next slide. Next slide. So here are just some of the reasons listed out for why we should prioritize low and moderate income households. I think many of you all already know all of this, but we'll say it anyway. Vulnerable populations are more exposed to climate risks. We're seeing this now with some of the horrors that we're seeing from Hurricane Helene. Some households and communities have more to gain from electrification, meaning and more to lose from the lack thereof. And we'll talk about that in a little. But effectively, some households are really dealing with poor indoor air quality and high energy burdens. And so electrification can be a pathway to reducing that. And then everyone enters electrification from a different point, including marginalized communities, members of disadvantaged communities, low and moderate income communities. And so prioritizing the prioritizing our friends and neighbors that will have the hardest time will by default mean that we are able to help everyone be able to access the benefits that electrification can bring. Next slide. So there's a lot on this slide. Go back one. So think of this as your neighborhood. So there are 6 people in this neighborhood, 6 homes in this neighborhood, evenly distributed. There's high income households, there are low income households. Each of them is paying for the gas infrastructure currently, if you all have gas appliances in your home. And that like thick gray bar, you can think of that as your gas pipeline. So we all pay a fixed charge for that. And in this case, it's $4,000. Next slide. As we have seen, more and more people are going electric. So let's say 3 people on your block electrify went all electric in your home. That same thick gray bar at the top is still there, still needs to be paid for. And so to cover up for the lack of, the three people or the three households in your community that are no longer paying, the folks who are still on the system will have to pay more. And so let's just say that process continues until there's only one household on gas. That household will basically subsidizing the entire project. And if you think people have high energy burdens now, imagine what it'll look like in this scenario. So a lot of communities across the country are going to be dealing with this as we are seeing more households switch to electrification. Next slide. All right, next slide. So here are some trends. I mentioned this earlier. Electrification is a term that means switching out a fossil fuel machine with an efficient electric version. Effectively, homeowners can do this now if they're able to, if they have the means. A lot of people don't have the means. And so fortunately, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which created the Home Electrification Appliance Rebate Program in Virginia. It'll be administered by the Department of Energy here. But this program will give incentives to help people make that switch. So to help people access efficient electric technologies. So that's one trend. Next slide. And then there's another trend. Next slide. Is that there are increasingly more tools available to help people as well. I'm just going to talk about Rewiring America's tools. And I'm happy to answer questions about this or chat offline. But replacing an HVAC system can be a lot. It can be overwhelming and confusing. How do you know how much it costs? How do you know like when incentives are available? How can you find a contractor to do the work? What's your first step? All of these are questions that I was actually just talking to my parents about the other day. And so we've created a tool that will be iterated over time, but the tool is designed to help any household understand how to replace their HVAC system or how to replace their stove or install renewable energy or things like that. So that's on our website. And the intent is to help people more seamlessly down that electrification path. Next slide. All right, that's it. I will pass it over to Aaron.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for having me join today. That was an excellent presentation and introduction from McKenna and Jamal. So I'm excited to talk now about trends that we're seeing in the Northeast with inclusive decarbonization. Next slide. So first, I'll just do a quick introduction of the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, which is where I work. I'm the senior manager of our policy and programs, but we are a regional energy efficiency organization, or a RIO, and we operate in the Northeast. So we go from West Virginia all the way up to Maine. So I'll be talking about trends in those states today. But our goal is to assist the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states to and affordably reduce building sector greenhouse gas emissions, and to do it through collaboration and partnerships. Next slide, please. Great. And today I'll be talking about inclusive decarbonization policies in the Northeast. And with that, I'll kick off my presentation. So first, I wanted to queue up this conversation. I'm going to share two resources. The first is this Decarbonizing Buildings report that we recently released, and we did it alongside with the Regulatory Assistance Project, which operates internationally to help states and countries accelerate building decarbonization, and NESCOM, which is the Northeast States Collaborative for Air Use Management, I believe, but it's NEEP works with state energy offices. NESCOM works with state environmental and air offices. So we did this report together to see how they can synergistically work together. And the report produces 4 table legs that I'll encourage you all to take a look at. But the idea is that building decarbonization can't happen with just one policy. It requires a whole suite of policy and actors in order to take action. And we've identified these 4 legs. And as you see, equity and workforce is the first leg we dive into in the report. So I'll go into that one a little bit more. But I also just wanted to highlight that within every section of the report, highlight equity and workforce initiatives, because we think that even if you're doing carbon reduction obligations, codes and standards, and utility planning, there's still key ways to center equity through all of those policies. And with that, I will now just dive into the equity and workforce leg. So next slide. So the equity and workforce leg of the brief highlights 4 key policies that we think states can take in order to center equity throughout any building decarbonization policy statewide. And so those 4 key policies are community empowerment, and this means inclusive and accessible stakeholder engagement that empowers community members to actually have meaningful impact on their programs. The next is metrics and goals, and these can be used as benchmarks to ensure equitable distribution of benefits and hold parties accountable to ensure that the benefits flow to communities. Goals are great ways to mandate that programs are designed a certain way, but tracking metrics means that you actually get to watch the program change and make sure it's accomplishing its goals as it's implemented. So they provide a feedback mechanism for program implementers. The next policy that we talk about is home upgrade hubs. And this is the stacking of programs, funding, and other resources together to maximize incentive and provide guidance and technical assistance. We're seeing a couple states start to come up with these now, but the idea is to make it so that the consumer and maybe even the contractor is able to touch on or collaborate with a bunch of different programs that might provide technical assistance, rebates, and other guidance, but it's a seamless interaction for the homeowner so that it's easier for them to participate in the program and all resources are brought to them instead of them having to navigate it themselves. And then the final policy we talk about is inclusive workforce development, because without actually investing in the workforce, building decarbonization is going to be very hard to do. So the brief goes into programs that support trainees with workforce development, including wraparound services and targeted outreach in underserved communities. So you want to make sure the workforce represents the communities that you're doing programs in, and that you're providing the workers and the community-based organizations the proper resources so that they can help be trained and be a part of the workforce. And with that, I'll now go through each of these policies and highlight what we're seeing in the Northeast with some specific program examples. So next slide. Perfect. Great. So under community empowerment, we're seeing actually quite a bit going on. So first, Massachusetts really stands out because they have taken, since they passed a law in 2021, I believe, they've taken a lot of initiatives to center communities and also to provide accessible materials. So their Mass Save program, which is their umbrella energy efficiency program, I believe provides materials in multiple language. I want to say 7 to 10, because they did an assessment to see what languages were spoken in the state. And now they are making sure to provide information in every language that they can that is spoken in the state. They also have a unique program called the Community First Partnerships Program that partners with community-based organizations on the ground and provides energy advocates. And these are just people that are employed to help anyone in the community, whether it's a homeowner or a business owner, navigate what energy efficiency programs are out there for them, and even just understand what energy efficiency is and how it can benefit. So it's a new touch point for the community. And they're actually tracking all of the interactions that these energy advocates have and seeing results and uptake. Next is Connecticut, and I'll bucket Connecticut and Vermont kind of together. They both right now are trying to change create new policies. So Connecticut has an equitable energy efficiency proceeding going on, and that's where they've actually encouraged and centered community input in order to change their energy efficiency programs. And Connecticut also, I just started offering payments for community advocates to participate in these working groups. Vermont passed a clean heat standard, which is a brand new policy. But as part of that standard, they mandated that an equity advisory group design what the program looks like and has input on the program. And so they're really centering community engagement as they create a brand new policy from scratch. And then finally, Maine has a clean energy partnerships program where they partner with local businesses and minority owned businesses in order to help them navigate the energy industry. And so those are a very quick snapshot of what we're seeing some states do with community empowerment in our region. Next, I will touch on goals and metrics. We can stay on the slide. But I wanted to highlight also another report that we have that will dive into the first example I'm going to give, Massachusetts, in a little more detail. But for goals and metrics, Massachusetts actually has an equity performance incentive. So just pulling back a little bit, performance incentives reward program implementers financially for succeeding in implementing their energy efficiency programs. And they're usually tied to savings or spending goals. But in Massachusetts, they actually have a net benefits performance incentive. So on the community level and low income or disadvantaged communities, they have to show a net benefit was received in that community from their programs. And as a result, they'll gain a higher financial incentive. So it's a great way to get the business aspect to really focus on communities and to track it to make sure that benefits are going to them. Maine tracks their distribution of benefits across the state. So I think annually, they report EVs, heat pumps, and heat pump water heaters, and they show geographically where they've had impact throughout the region. So you can see the program is actually spreading benefits around. And then in Vermont, the clean heat standard that I talked about earlier has mandates so that 16% of the benefits have to flow to low income communities and 16% have to flow to moderate income. And just a quick overview of what a clean heat standard is. It's sort of like a renewable portfolio standard. It mandates fuel dealers deliver heat pumps. So it's mandating that homes in Vermont receive heat pumps, which really reduces your energy bills overall because fuel is unregulated and the price changes. And so the clean heat standard mandated that 16% of the installs that happen every year are low income and 16% go into moderate income homes, just guaranteeing that 32% of the benefits every year are actually seen in homes that really need them. Next slide, please. And then this will be my last slide, but I'll just talk about what we're seeing with home upgrade hubs and inclusive workforce development. So as far as home upgrade hubs, and these are newer programs that we're seeing to really help implement energy efficiency and actually building performance standards. So Massachusetts has something called LEAN, which is not an acronym for anything that I can tell right now, but it is their comprehensive single family program, and they've recently launched a multifamily program in the past year. It's been interesting to watch the state try to figure out how they can gather funding and queue in to multifamily improvement cycles, a whole new sector to tackle and very different than how we see single family homes. And then Washington, D.C. actually designed an affordable housing retrofit accelerator, and they created this program in response to the state passing a building performance standard. I'm sorry, the district passing a building performance standard, recognizing that building performance standards, they create a mandate on building owners in order to make their buildings more efficient, but it creates a mandate and a penalty, but that can leave behind affordable housing complexes that might not have the funding to update their systems, and then will get hit with a penalty for not actually meeting the building performance standard. So the district used, I believe it was an initial round of funding, and the acronym's escaping me, before BIL was enacted, and they created an affordable housing retrofit accelerator that provides technical assistance and baits for multifamily affordable housing owners so that they are not negatively impacted by the building performance standard. And then finally, just some great highlights that we're seeing when it comes to inclusive workforce development. Washington, D.C. has an energy efficiency workforce development program, and their energy efficiency implementer actually is required to create sustaining jobs from the program. So they track how many employees go through the program or hired in a meaningful role afterwards. And this program also provides wraparound services, trainings, and any resources that a trainee might need in order to ensure they succeed within the program. And then Massachusetts also has a very similar program. It's called Clean Energy Pathways. It's interesting though, because Massachusetts has a strong workforce program, but they are mandated by law to invest in it. So it took the state passing a law saying you have to spend, first it was 12 million, and now it's 24 million a year on inclusive workforce development. And now the utilities across the state have a very strong energy efficiency program that's focused on the community level. And then finally, New York has a clean energy business program where they track and report metrics to make sure to track all the trainees that go through the program, and they provide on the job hourly wages so that employers don't have to pay for trainees to get service, but they'll match up trainees with potential employers and pay for their training and for their employment while they initially get, oh, thank you, while they initially get trained up. And thanks to the person that highlighted the ARPA funding for the DC accelerator. With that, I believe that finishes off my snapshot of the Northeast. Happy to take any questions, or if anyone's interested in the program, send any more additional information about them. And I will pass it to Maggie.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone, and apologies, I'm in an airport, so if you hear some background noise, that might be it. But I'm excited to be with y'all all today, and thanks to McKenna, Jamal, and Erin for laying a lot of groundwork, because I'm going to take a lot of what they say. You'll see some of it repeated, but we'll move through that somewhat quickly and focus on what it looks like in the Southeast. I know Virginia is an interesting state, as the Commonwealth is kind of both really wanting to join the likes of those progressive policies we see in the Northeast, while also being sandwiched some in the realities of being a Southeast state in some ways. And SEIA is actually the regional energy efficiency organization that serves Virginia. And so we're going to jump into a little bit about what we're seeing. But if we go to the next slide, if you don't know us already, the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, we're based in Atlanta, but we serve all of the Southeast and actually all of the U.S. islands as well, as we work in and around, making sure that people have a robust life in an equitable energy economy in our region. And that's through building work, that's transportation, utility and financing spaces as well. And we really ensure that the policy and programmatic work that we do sits in our values, our staff-defined values, which you can see on the screen here, for taking initiative and valuing others, earning trust, and pursuing equitable solutions. And my hope is that through this presentation, but also through your other interactions with our organization, you see those values show up in our work and in our work together. But I want to jump into this last one, this pursuing equitable solutions piece on the next slide, and what we mean by that. So since we serve the Southeast, we kind of have to sit in the reality that we recognize, acknowledge, and account for a history of prejudice and inequality in our communities, and the roles that it plays and the issues that we address. And McKenna did a great job highlighting earlier the kind of three large definitions around equity, and we use just a little bit of a different terminology, but they're the same thing, from procedural equity, really making sure that decision-making voice is there, distributional equity, that the burdens and the benefits are distributed equally throughout communities, and intergenerational equity, ensuring that we're thinking about the future in the same way that the past thought about us and their policy and programmatic design. Let's talk a little bit about how this shows up in the electrification space and inclusivity in the Southeast. If you'll go to the next slide, you're going to see a map that's taken from the most recent residential energy consumption survey, or REC data, that looked at the electrification of quite frankly the country. You'll see the Southeast is in this red shade, and it's actually showing us that most of the Southeast is highly electrified. About 32 or a little over 32 million housing units in like the South Atlantic and East South Central census divisions, which is how they do it at REC, use utility gas or electric compared to the 12 million who use utility gas. And then additionally, we've got about 3 million people who use in households who use propane, and that's largely in those more rural areas. You can kind of see those hot spots happening throughout the South there. We still have about 2 million households, 2.5 million households using wood as their primary heating source. And just over 600,000 households on fuel oil or kerosene. What I'll note, though, about all of this red, all of this electric heating across the region, that a lot of these homes are electric furnace. So what Jamal was talking about earlier was that switch from there's a side of switching from natural gas to or other fossil fuels to a more efficient heat pump. There's also the need to switch from electric furnaces to heat pumps, which is really the problem of the Southeast. I like to say that heating your home with electric furnace is akin to heating your home with a hair dryer, comparatively to a more efficient heat pump system. And on the next slide, we'll kind of break down, as you all may know, living in the Southeast, the homes are older, and those aging homes can be more expensive the older that they are. I think it's important to note that about 57%, so almost 2/3 of homes in the Southeast were built before 1980. So when we're looking at this graph, which I'll go into in a second, it's important to note that majority of the people in the Southeast are living in kind of the second half or the bottom half of this affordability graph. And really what this does, we've taken this data also from REX and EIA that breaks down kind of by age and housing stock age in the region, how much on average someone is spending on their cost, their energy cost. So that larger blue bar on every piece of electricity. The next over is natural gas. You've got some propane, and you've got fuel oil and kerosene there at the end. And you'll note that really the only homes that on average are using fuel oil and kerosene are those that are built 1890, so 1889 and prior. And so that's majority of the housing stock in the Southeast. And while not all of them are using that, it's a very expensive a source of energy to be using right now. So I think the big question, and on the next slide, we'll kind of talk about like the fact that decarbonization is a system goal. Like decarbonization, as we're talking about it, cannot just be an individual goal, although like Jamal showed, like there are plenty of pathways that we should make sure that consumers and businesses have access to, but it is in service of a system. And I think it's important to know that as we're thinking about decarbonization, greenhouse gas emissions can vary, obviously, by location and by time. And this top map, which when you get the slides and can click on the link, these maps are actually very interactive. So they're very fun to use from the Energy Information Administration. But the Southeast, as far as carbon intensity for power generation, is doing about average on average. So on average, we're about the same or about right in the middle of every other region of the country. However, we are improving everywhere. And this bottom map really shows the change in carbon intensity. And every single state in the Southeast region has had a net decrease in that change. And in Virginia in particular, where Virginia is sitting in that between 100 and 200 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, has decreased from 2016 to 2020. I think we'll get the more updated data here pretty soon. But that's an exciting thing, and noting that when we're thinking about the system as a whole, that it's a really important piece, because we can electrify, but the siting and the sourcing and the generation of those pieces, that electricity matters. And at the same time, it's important to note how the system is kind of moving together. So let's talk about this inclusivity part. Most folks here might be familiar with energy burden, and on the next slide, you'll see kind of our this is how you calculate energy burden. Kind of percentage here. And I think what's important to note about this, and something that we sit in here, is that energy burden, while a helpful metric in a lot of ways, is a snapshot in time. Someone may not be energy burdened, and not use their heating or cooling equipment, or not have heating and cooling equipment in their home. And if we were to add that, maybe they hop up above that, what is seen as 6% as becomes anything over that is thought of as unaffordable. And so when we think about energy burden, while it can be a helpful metric, we really like to think more about energy insecurity, which on the next slide you'll be able to see more of what that is. But essentially, it is ensuring that households have, and quite frankly businesses as well, have an ability or have an inability to adequately meet their basic energy needs. Right. So think about food insecurity, but for energy. And I think that's a really important piece. And I'm actually going to link in the chat our energy insecurity story map for the South. And it's interactive. You can have a good time with that. It tells us a little bit about the story on your own time. But I think it's important to put this in context of what this means in the Southeast. And in the next slide, you'll see a map of the Southeast. Or no, you won't yet. What you're going to see here is what this looks like metric-wise. So almost 15.5 million households experience energy insecurity in our region, which is the highest percentage in the U.S. 42% of the households in the Southeast are at an unhealthy, or 42% of households that are at an unhealthy temperature are in the South, as well as 39% of households that receive disconnection notices across the country are in the South. And 44% of households that are reducing in the South are reducing consumption of food or medicine to pay for energy, right? That heat or eat sacrifice and decision that folks deal with. And that's a very large number here. But now on the next slide, you're actually going to see a map of what it looks like in the Southeast plus Texas. We did this work alongside TEPRI, the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, of every county non-low income household energy burden. And you're like, this has no data on it. Actually, it does. Every non-low income household on average spends 0 to 6% of their income on energy. That's every single county on average in the region. But you'll compare that on the next slide to low income household energy burden, and it's a drastically different story, right? While there are some that on average, right, and we know those averages can look nuanced when you get down into neighborhood and community levels. On average, it's a very different story for our low income populations. And so I think it's really important for us to sit in and recognize that, like, these pieces, if we are not doing them inclusively, we're going to have these challenges. And a lot of these households are electrified. So just, thinking about electrification for the sake of electrification, isn't going to necessarily solve all of our cost burden issues. We have to think deeper about these challenges together. And so what's really interesting about this too is demographic data plays a role. So the next slide will show you the same map, but aligned with racial identity. So if you'll go to the next slide, you can see, so what you see here is the darker the color, whether that's blue or pink, and our new ones are, you can add a layer for if you have color blindness of multiple types, but for the sake of today, this is what I have. But the darker the color, the higher the energy burden. And you'll notice that there's a blue, deep blue, kind of almost purple color that leads from Virginia down into Mississippi. That is considered the Black Belt or the plantation belt of the Southeast. And those are majority minority energy burden, low income energy burden populations. You can also very clearly see Appalachia, where you have very high energy burden, energy insecurity, high costs, but low minority populations. And all are very critical, but I think it's important to note that race does play a role. In fact, in the Southeast, if you are a Black household, you on average pay more for your energy than any other demographic group. And you can dig more into that data in that story map that I shared. So what is beneficial and equitable electrification. So on the next slide, we like to lean on some friends to think about how to think about these pieces. And Erin shared this regulatory assistance project piece too. That beneficial, right, electrification. It has to do one of these three things, hopefully more than one, but that saving consumers money over the long run, enabling better grid management, and reducing negative environmental impacts. And when we layer on equity, though, and those definitions that McKenna laid out earlier, I think it's important that we think about how we save people money over the long run without increasing costs for low and moderate income households in the short run. Right. I like to give an example of Memphis, Tennessee, that if we were to go in and support the transition of all of low income households from their gas appliances to electric appliances, their energy bills and energy cost burden would go up actually close to 30%. Because their electricity is significantly more expensive than gas. Right. And so thinking about how we do things long term, but also thinking about the short term is really critical as we're thinking about equitable electrification. We also want to make sure that it's accessible and affordable to underrepresented communities, and these communities should be empowered and engaged in that decision making, right? Not just informed, not just considered, but empowered and engaged. And that's a really critical piece. And we worked alongside the Building Performance Association to kind of align around that. So what does it look like in Virginia? There's Redstock is a tool from the National Renewable Energy Lab or NREL. And I'll drop a link over to the Virginia fact sheet if you want to. It's also interactive. I love an interactive tool, so you can play around with it. But this is kind of a screen capture there. I'll note that when I look at the region as a whole, our electric furnaces, like I said earlier, are about 25 to 30% of primary heating sources. On average, right? In Florida, I think it's somewhere around 50%. In Virginia, it's only around 15% of the primary for those electric resistance furnaces. And so I think it's important to note, and just kind of a thing to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about program implementation or policy work. But on this fact sheet, you can also find that about 28% of energy that's being used by Virginia households could be saved through cost-effective measures. And these are those measures that kind of are aligned there. And right, they reduce strain on the grid as well as that GHG reliability. So really, we're thinking about the entire system, right? Not just for households, which is really critical, but thinking about how that system shares and then equally distributes the benefits and the burdens of our larger energy system. And energy efficiency, obviously, as representing an organization where energy efficiency is in our name, I think it's really important to note that a lot of these measures, while electrification is a clear piece and of this, I think it's also important to note that the second highest cost effective measure here is doing a drill and fill wall cavity with insulation, right? And so thinking about how we marry together doing the electrification alongside weatherization and energy efficiency efforts is really, really critical in how we do this. And so I'll leave you with this. My last slide is that a lot of the work that we're doing in CS, so I gave you kind of some overviews of pieces, but a lot of the work that we're also doing alongside BAEC and all of the AEC's member organizations is thinking about how we shift the focus to people. And ensuring that building energy efficiency policies and programs are of course technically correct and reducing kilowatt hours and CO2 and they're saving jobs and all of that good stuff. But we're recentering people into the middle of it. That we're thinking about buildings, and I lead the buildings team, but we're thinking really about all of our work about what if we think about them for the occupants, right? We're not building 4 walls and a roof for no reason, right? And so thinking about how we center occupants, and that could be around occupant language or metrics or program design and inclusive and engagement and leadership, and also workforce and who builds, maintains, installs this equipment, these buildings, these homes. I think that's a really big piece here. And so I'll leave y'all with the idea that as we're walking down this road together in partnership, and thinking about this work, that we are doing all that we can to make sure that focus is sitting in and around people. And I think if we're able to do that, we'll get a lot further altogether. So thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, and to our other wonderful panelists for presenting such a nuanced and thorough presentation that encompasses the broader and more technical aspects of implementing environmental justice into programming and what the landscape looks like, especially in the Southeast and Northeast. So thank you again. Right now, we are opened up for a Q&A, and we only have 16 minutes. So I will dive right in with the first question. So the terms seem to have changed over the years as it relates to electrification. There's strategic electrification, beneficial electrification, and now decarbonization. How do you view these terms as interchangeable, if you do? And if not, how does inclusivity fit into these types of terms, and are they different?
I don't
I could,
necessarily.
yeah,
Oh,
go ahead, Jamal.
yeah, I don't view them as like entire. I don't view them as different really. Um, I think like beneficial electrification, strategic electrification are, in my opinion, interchangeable. I think both are centered around ensuring that um, there are reasons why we're electrifying, aren't just doing so um, solely for the sake of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Uh, Decarbonization, um, I would I actually would say that that's a different term. I don't think I mean um, decarbonization just means carbon from removing carbon, and some might say that there are different ways to do that. So like biomass or um, nuclear energy, hydrogen. Like some might say that these are other ways of decarbonizing. Um, I don't personally believe that those are worthwhile ways, particularly when it comes to like our building stock. And so electrification and strategic electrification, I think, is really important. I think the one thing where it's important to note that uh, in a programmatic sense, like in the as in a program where the goal is to facilitate the improvement of someone's HVAC system, I think we do want to do that in a way that is in the best interest of the household. And I think that is very different than like from a policy perspective where um, the different policies of a place, of a jurisdiction, of a state can change what is strategic about electrification. And so working at a policy level to like massage the enabling environment such that um, there so such that electrification is strategic or beneficial in all cases, I think is would be the goal in my opinion. But I will pass it off to Maggie.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Jamal on a lot of things, including this. But I'll say that I think what's important about your question, McKenna, is that I think it's important in whatever room we walk into that we're clear on these words, right? Because I do think that in different rooms and different groups of people and perspectives, these words can mean different things, and we're not always using them the same way, right? If you go and look up on one organization or one company, they may use a word a little bit differently based on who their stakeholders are, right? And so I think that inclusivity piece, right, is ensuring that we're clear about what these words mean and what they don't mean also, I think is important, right? And so, I think in the bigger picture of things, I think I completely agree with Jamal around those pieces, but I do think it's really important that we do those definitions. And I'll just say I loved that all of us gave definitions across our presentations today, because I think that's a really critical part of doing this inclusive work together.
Thank you,
Yeah.
both of you. Oh, sorry, Erin.
No, I was just going to add on, kind of seconding what Maggie said, that I would say throughout the region that I work in, every state uses different terminology, but what helps is having a definition so you understand what the communities are and what the goal is, for everyone to coalesce around. So words could change, but the meanings, I think, just definitely need to be clear.
Absolutely. I agree with your perspectives and think that the central goal should be supporting communities who are experiencing energy burdens and those who are interested and able to and willing to transition into a more energy efficient and possibly, depending on circumstances, electrified future. Before we get to the question in the chat, I wanted to ask you all, specifically Jamal and Erin, you've both touched on how equity, I mean, everyone has, but how equity must be central to decarbonization. And so in practice, what specific steps can policymakers take to avoid the risk of creating programs that inadvertently widen the gap between low income and wealthier households in terms of energy access? And this is for everyone, this is a small panel, so.
I can kick us off, but I think just engagement and having input on what the policy is before it's even proposed on some level is how you have to start. Because coming up with an idea, I think it can all seem great on paper, but sometimes we don't know what we don't know. When policymakers write policy, they're not sure what it looks like on the ground and what the actual impacts are or what the needs are in order to accomplish a goal. So talking to representatives from the disadvantaged communities as soon as the idea is even starting to form is a great way to start. And if not, I think we've seen other policies in our region pass where it's mandated that there's engagement as soon as it kicks off. And there's also a mandate to see benefits, which I would call that kind of like a second tier, when the first tier is you want to communicate what your idea is and get feedback to make sure it fits with their needs, it is encompassing them.
Yeah, I would agree with what Erin said.
I'm gonna drop a resource in the chat real quick. I know there's a lot of really great resources out there and helping people think about what it means to engage people, but I really appreciate Movement Strategy Center and the work that they've done to kind of create this usable spectrum of what it looks like to go from community engagement to ownership and community ownership, and kind of really thinking about how policymakers and decision makers and stakeholders like we are here, right, help to inform them on what that can look like, from really assessing where we go from ignoring and marginalizing folks to deferring to folks in community and what community ownership looks like. And I think different programs, different policies may fall into different ones of these categories, hopefully not the ignoring side, but in the 1 through 5, at some point in the process, right? And it might evolve, and some people may be in certain places with certain programs and want to evolve to different spaces and places. But I think this can be a really helpful tool and resource for folks to use, and something we use a lot at CF.
Wonderful. Thank you both for your insight, Erin and Maggie. And I will say ditto to that. The final, I mean, depends how long this one takes, but another question that we had was from Stephen in the chat. Can you all speak to some of the challenges with electrification in older buildings that have limited electrical service that can be a big component to the cost of conversion?
no one want to jump at that immediately. I can start first, just in saying that what I find really interesting and kind of watching the national lab side and the product development side that we're seeing happen is that we're actually seeing a lot of um, uh, there's a little bit of combination happening in some of the heat pump appliances. So combining our heat pump water heater and our air source heat pump into like one electrical load. And there's a lot of really cool new technology that is coming out and being certified under Energy Star to fall into programs and rebate and incentive programs that will be able to support with this, right? Panel size is a challenge throughout the country, even on newer homes in some places, depending on how what the requirements are in the building codes in that area. And so, the part is cost, and I think that at this stage we are being really having to be really reliant on rebates and program design and incentives. And I know that's not necessarily the best answer, but at the moment when we're thinking about inclusivity and reaching populations, that's really the what we have to think about, as well as some innovative financing, right? But the cost doesn't make it not worth it and not worth doing. It's more about figuring out how we accomplish this cost. And right now we have a lot of different things that we can layer. And I think Jamal shared in the chat some of the rebate information from Rewiring America. But Jamal, do you have more you want to add?
Yeah, I mean it is an issue right now. It is particularly homes in the Northeast also are dealing with this, where existing panels can't do not have enough capacity to operate newer technology. But I think Maggie's point is a good one, in that the technology of today is not necessarily the technology of tomorrow. And so while we do have these issues right now, and there are incentives available to help cover some of those costs, so the home energy rebates, there are rebates for panel upgrades. There are tax credits for this as well. If you happen to be installing solar, you can get panels covered in that also. And so, yeah, I agree with Maggie. Over reliance on incentives right now to help cover the cost. But I will specifically name that there are a specific technology called a smart panel, which is also really helpful, which um, operates helps navigate the load of a panel. So you don't need to be, you're not often running your dryer and your heat pump and stove and all this stuff all at once. Like sometimes you can shut the heat off for a little bit, run your dryer, and the smart panel kind of helps you navigate that, so that there is enough load on the panel for whatever you're trying to do. And so that is becoming more and more prevalent out in the market and can help address the need for a panel upgrade in the first place.
Wonderful, thank you. We only have a few minutes left, and there's another question related to financing approaches, and I don't think we'll have time to fully cover that one, but want to uplift again what Jamal has shared and what other individuals have shared about financing approaches, because as we know, equity means going beyond the technology to consider the full ecosystem of the conditions that LMI households live within. So again, this includes wraparound services like financing options, tenant protections, long-term affordability measures, and even thinking about workforce, thinking about PLAs, project labor agreements. We have to ask ourselves questions like, how are we designing programs to ensure sustained access for LMI households? Are we creating opportunities for comprehensive support? Or are we just contributing to inequities by not considering these critical components? For example, as it relates to home energy rebates, how are renters being protected when landlords decide to electrify? Or are we just focusing on homeowners within the work that we're doing in the Commonwealth? in what ways can we improve the integration of equity into every stage of program development and implementation? Because if these programs don't prioritize equity from the onset in terms of implementation for whoever becomes the implementer, we would risk further entrenching the disparities we're supposed to be addressing, and that affects all of us, not just LMI households. So ask yourself, like, if we are willing to dig deeper and think more critically about what it means to ensure this renewable energy transition works for everyone, especially those who need it. So thank you for, again, all your thoughtfulness and the responses and the feedback and just your leadership in general. And I very much look forward to following along the work of our panelists in the upcoming months and years, especially with new states being obligated funds out of the home energy rebates. Let's push these efforts forward.
Thank you, McKenna, especially for your leadership on this issue. You very easily could have been on this panel, so I just want to give you your flowers too.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you for your work and the service that you're giving to this organization, to VAEC as a board member. It's great. I would encourage folks who are listening to this panel to get more involved with the organization if you're not already, and the work that they're doing. The board has really outlined a lot of really great work, and the staff is doing great things, as you'll see with this forum, around this work, and a lot of that is due to McKenna's leadership.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing many of you tomorrow.
Hello all, just wanted to thank you for joining us today. I hope that you learned a lot from our informative panels. Please don't forget to join us tomorrow in person at the University of Richmond. We are so excited to see many of you. Once again, thank you to our sponsors, whom we could not put this event on without. Are there any other slides? Yes, okay. Just a reminder what the day 2 agenda is. We are very excited to have Angela Navarro joining us tomorrow as a former SCC commissioner. We'll have our one plenary panel on the multifamily multiverse, navigating the fund maze beyond weatherization, as well as our annual Energy Efficiency Leadership Awards ceremony and networking reception. So we cannot wait to see all of you there. Here is the information if you don't have the address. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye, everyone.